Our conference has called on us to examine the challenges and rewards held out by an exploded field in the wake of art history's global turn. And we have seen over the last few days tremendous results. For my part, I would like to begin by calling into question what seems an implicit supposition of the call, that there was or ever could have been a united field. As a US-educated art historian who has taught the last 9 years at the Université de Montréal, the untranslatable Université de Montréal, one of Montreal's 2 French-speaking universities, where part of the impetus for my hire was to bridge what they call in Canada les deux solitudes, or the 2 solitudes. I wonder if the supposition of a formerly united field is more likely made while practicing in English from the United States, or perhaps Britain or Toronto, but not in a country whose first language is not English, not even in only 200 miles from here in Quebec. One of my earlier experiences of the divided field came in 1999, following the publication of my first book on the origins and function of Orientalism, Egyptology, and Egyptomania, and their links to French imperialism in North Africa. In Paris, I met with the buyer for the bookstore of the Institut du Monde Arabe to see if they would carry the book. She explained to me with utter lucidity that if she had 2 books on the same subject, one in French and the other in English, she would carry the one in French. On the other hand, if she had a book on a subject that existed only in English, then it was not a subject. There I learned something about our united field and the production and dissemination of knowledge. Even as I recognize that the fissure between French and English, or between art history in North America and France, may exemplify the narcissism of small differences, I remain persuaded that we begin with a diverse and fissured field. Still, globalization, which Jürgen Osterhammel defined as the development, concentration, and increasing importance of worldwide integration, may raise the palpable specter of integration as homogenization, notwithstanding the evolving character of globalization over its modern history since the 16th century. It was in any case that threat that the political philosopher Benjamin Constant evoked already in 1814 as he looked back over the rubble of the Napoleonic Empire, and I quote him, "The conquerors of our days, nations or princes, want that their empires display only a uniform surface over which the superb eye of power traverses, without meeting a single inequality to injure it or to hinder its view. The same code, the same measures, the same rules, and if when it can be achieved gradually the same language, that is what is being proclaimed as perfection in all social organization. The big word today is uniformity." He goes on, "It's too bad that we can't level all the cities in order to rebuild everything according to the same plan, level all the mountains so that the train will be everywhere equal. And it surprises me that they have not yet ordered all inhabitants to wear the same costume, so that the master will not encounter any motley disorder or any shocking variety," end quote. Faced both with the menace of a uniform field and the frustration of the divided, today I will look at the work of the contemporary Argentine artist Leon Ferrari, born in 1920 and still practicing today. Not necessarily to break any new ground regarding Ferrari, but in order to think the challenge of the global field via the 2 main axes of his work. They concern the political inheritance of canonical Western art history and the potential and challenge of language. And my basic proposition is that in the wake of the global field, we might make 2 contradictory moves. 1, to resist, and 2, to bridge. So first, to resist. Part of the seduction of globalization emanates from the mistaken notion that global integration produces democracy, which in turn yields equality. But this Jacques Derrida pointed out in his 2003 book, Philosophy in a Time of Terror, is an illusion. And I quote him, "Though the discourse in favor of globalization insists on the transparency made possible by teletechnologies, the opening of borders and of markets, the leveling of playing fields, and the equality of opportunity, there have never been in the history of humanity in absolute numbers so many inequalities," which he then goes on to name, as are being named today in Occupy Wall Street, in Montreal and Oakland and elsewhere. From this point of view, globalization is not taking place. It is a simulacrum a rhetorical artifice or weapon that dissimulates a growing imbalance, a new opacity, a garrulous and hyper-mediatized non-communication, a tremendous accumulation of wealth, means of production, teletechnologies, and sophisticated military weapons, and the appropriation of all those powers by a small number of states or international corporations. And yet, wherever it is believed that globalization is taking place, it is, for better and for worse, end quote. Finally, Derrida posits that globalization carries a Christian imprint in its pattern and movement, and he therefore rebrands the phenomenon as global Latinization. To my mind, the critical and deconstructive project called for by Derrida has been a part of Ferrari's art for more than 4 decades. He is a long-standing critic of global Latinization. I first came across his work in 2004 at the retrospective at the Buenos Aires Centro Cultural Caleta, where I was struck not only by his critique of Western arts history, but also by its relevance for the Americas at large, from Buenos Aires to Quebec City, for the area of study that Alan Greer and Kenneth Mills have called the Catholic Atlantic. That 2004 exhibition has come to be considered as one of the most important events in Argentine art history, for its quality and for the controversies that surround it. Even before its late 2004 run, Catholic Church officials rushed to condemn it, and then there were continual bomb threats, and Catholic extremists broke into the exhibition and smashed this 1992 work called Bottles, which had first been exhibited in Hamburg in '92 in the One World Art Show, which recognized the 500th anniversary of European conquests in the Americas. Ferrari sent there some 80 bottles containing souvenirs of the European conquest and condoms, thereby linking the Church's global conquests with its prohibition on this means for AIDS prevention. In other words, linking global conquest and global disease. Following the 2004 vandalism, the inaptly named judge, Elena Liberatore, closed the exhibition, and then critical forces mobilized support and forced the show's reopening. Now, those bottles address globalization using an idiom current in South American contemporary art. Elsewhere, in this first of the veins of Ferrari's work, the Argentine artist redeploys the canonical from Western art history, asserting, as he did in his 1995 Guggenheim Fellowship application, that the violence of Western Christian civilization and imperialism is not anathema to the West, but instead its obvious outgrowth. While it may be said that through post-colonial theory, art historians have accomplished the deconstructive critique of art and violence, Ferrari persists, and global events from Vietnam to Argentina to Iraq have continued to validate his claim. The project began in the mid-'60s, notably with this 2-meter-long Western and Christian civilization, in which he associated the FH-107 US bomber used in Vietnam with Christian art and its theology of suffering. His project targets certain iconographies in canonical art, notably The Last Judgment. In a 1985 sculpture show at the Museum of Modern Art in Sao Paulo, he showed a cage with pigeons defecating onto 10 reproductions of Last Judgments by Michelangelo, Giotto, Tintoretto, Roger van der Weyden, and others. Paintings which in another context the art historian Iris Grotecki has qualified as machines for intolerance, that target, in particular, women, sexuality, sodomy, and infidels, notably Jews and Muslims. In his 1986 essay, Multinationals, Ferrari went on to link the graphic publicity of Hell's Menace with state-sponsored violence. And then his 1995 publication, Nunca Más, reads as a magisterial encyclopedia of the phenomenon. This governmental report that documented activities of the Argentine dictatorship of the 1970s and 80s became obligatory teaching in schools, and the progressive paper, Página 12, produced this 1,008-page edition illustrated by Ferrari with photos and collage. The cover of the first issue overlays, on a vision of the damned from a Hans Memling burning hell, the portico of the Buenos Aires headquarters for the detention, torture, and murder of political or social undesirables. Ferrari's position is that the violence of Christianity and its art have had an eminently transferable applicability in Vietnam and Argentina, and more recently in Iraq, as in the 2004 collage that brings together Christian tortures with those at Abu Ghraib. Can an art history of the global not consider these aspects of what long has been its canon? Or does the art historian of the global accede to Ernst Gombrich's call in a 1990s interview, in which he said that notwithstanding the crimes committed in the name of Western civilization, the essential task of the art historian is to function as its spokesperson? Part 2, to bridge. An enriching aspect of our discipline derives from the diversity of languages in which it is practiced. Mark Haxthausen, in his closing essay to the Clark Papers on the art historian, noticed how it had been largely unarticulated in the conference on that subject, but in fact marks the discipline. The forces of globalization and the globalization debate bring the question of language to the fore. A telling example. Derrida recommends the distinction between globalisation and mondialisation. In French, globalization is clearly associated with free market, unregulated capitalist economics, and of American, meaning US, ambition for hegemony. In fact, in a passage in another text, Derrida is talking about religion and globalization. He says it's like an English word that has been to Rome and taken a detour to the United States. Whereas Derrida prefers the more positively connoted mondialisation, what he translates as worldwideization, associating it with the rise after World War II of worldwide human rights and the prosecution of crimes against humanity. We could say that from this French perspective, globalization is what is proper to the false consciousness of the cosmos, whereas mondialisation relates to what is proper to humanity, one of whose aspects, I submit, is the question of language. The prospect that art and art history in the global age will be practiced increasingly and with exclusive reward in English is a concern of some artists and art historians. And judging by the conversations that I've had this week, maybe this is or should be a preoccupation, especially for native English speakers. In any case, at this fall's Lyon Biennale, it was the subject of a room installed by a Johannesburg collective called the Center for Historical Reenactments. And I show you here, this is one wall, and then I'll highlight 3 panels for your consideration on the role of language in contemporary art and artistic identity on the global stage. Here in this fuzzy photo, a note that says, "À Paris, quelqu'un m'a demandé si je parlais français." In Paris, someone asked me whether I spoke French. An artist who cannot speak English is no artist. And finally, say, if you speak English, we must be getting near civilization. In order to encourage transversal encounters in the field, I've been involved in an experiment for the last 10 years, the Réseau International pour la Formation en Histoire de l'Art, which brings together junior and senior scholars annually for a week-long springtime academy. It treats a transversal theme in the history of art each time, like style or the notion of civilization, one that might attract research presentations from specialists from all geographic, media, and periods of the discipline, all the better to see and to connect how art history is being practiced in 9 countries of the Réseau, and they come from North America, Western Europe, and Japan, and simultaneously speaking in the Réseau's 4 languages, English, French, German, and Italian. Even as we risk that each performs his or her national stereotype, we hope that through contact and juxtaposition, the next generation will better evaluate, hone, engage, and refine their practices of the discipline with greater knowledge and experience of their international counterparts. And we're now working to expand that project beyond the Northern Hemisphere to other linguistic and art historical traditions. So now, as in the second part on To Bridge, this is where I turn to the yes, but it's easier said than done. The difficulty limits, or maybe even the impossibility of the task, can be identified in the other major vein of Ferrare's production, his written paintings, where we find those irresolvable frictions, disunities, and incommensurabilities, a performance of that sustained grappling of the deeply divided to which Aruna and Jill have referred. Begun in the early 60s, they are, according to the artist, opposite to his political collages and prints, abstract, poetic, a site of the free reign of the imagination. Notwithstanding this supposed dichotomy, the legacy of words and language is as freighted as the traditions of the Western artistic canon. In this 1964 collage, Noah's Ark or the Impregnating Tree, Ferrari rewrites the biblical story of the flood, and Noah came up earlier this morning, so it's the second time for him. But Ferrari writes him out of the biblical story here, so that instead of Noah, the survivors are 1,000 wise and sinful women, the revolutionaries, the marvelous atheists who know how to master their bodies at free will. To float, these women inflate their breasts, and Satan, whom he calls that exiled inventor, took the penises of the dying men, grafted them onto a floating tree where women impregnated themselves and joyfully populated the earth, and God could do nothing against this life. In this work that combines his loopy writing and art historical appropriation, we see an example of what Luis Kamnitzer identified as the critical operating purpose of Latin American conceptualism, the didactics of liberation, in the face of various kinds of weight and tradition. Living in Brazil from 1976 to 1984, exiled from his country's dictatorship, Ferrari experimented with his own alphabets. Andrea Giunta, whose work on Ferrari has been indispensable, astutely noted that in this moment of extreme violence and exile and in transition between Argentina and Brazil, he had to find signs that went beyond naming the indescribable by way of opaque references and allusions, and that would allow him to articulate a language. Playful but highly motivated, his languages include these wholly invented codes of 1979, in which he seeks to invent useful and stable hieroglyphs, a vocabulary, well-ordered, perhaps random, but still reliable, and a Kama Sutra, a sensual in the bending, gripping, touching lines, as well as his translations with their inevitably perplexing blocks. From my disciplinary perspective, Ferrari's Gambit is an extension of the romantic modern project of the French Revolution and its aftermath, where we find gestures, for instance, like the French Revolutionary calendar that sought to wipe the slate clean of corrupt accretion and restart the calendar at year one, or in the writings of the British Romantic poets who sought a natural, one might say universal or global, language free of corrupt and arbitrary allegory. Ferrari's art, though, is also a reminder of limits on the possibilities of fully successfully linking through language, however much the complexity of languages guarantees richness to an international and multilingual art historical discipline. In Ferrari, sometimes those limits are political, as in his 1963 letter to a general, which is a performance of illegibility that is imposed by the military censors. Other times, the limits of expression derive from the deficiencies of language and those who might wield it. And this conundrum takes us back to the circumstances that led to Ferrari becoming an artist. Educated and practicing as an engineer into his 30s, so into the early 1950s, he became an artist only following his and his wife's departure for Italy in 1952, when they sought treatment for Mariali, their 4-year-old daughter, who with the onset of meningitis was becoming deaf. In her 1985 book, The Story of a Deaf Child, Alicia Ferrari, the artist's wife, recounts how they painstakingly tried to teach their daughter a basic vocabulary of 100 words that would stay with her even after she became deaf. Hands of 1964 evokes the frustration of trying to make words and gestures stick, to make them mean, to make them communicate, to have sign and signifier cohere across a language barrier even within the same family. And this is a large-scale box in the Malba collection, several inches deep. And there's some drawing on the support, but most of the lines derive from black metal coils which fill the box. Dozens of paper hands, tilted in nearly every direction, are caught up in the coils. They arrest, struggle, sign, disappear, puncture, and wave. How can we not see Ferrari exploring the many ways and the frustrating limits of the efficacy of language? In closing, if I have anything to contribute today that's original about Ferrari's work, it might be to say that the two veins of his production have a common root in the challenge posed by the freighted conventions and traditions in both art and language, and that loaded inheritance is also a challenge to the global field, namely regarding three issues: the positions from which we practice the discipline, the tasks we set ourselves as art historians, and the limits to our capacities to bridge across a never-united field. Thank you.